Oliver Cromwell gave his country a decade of leadership, dismantled a monarchy, and governed a fractured nation without wearing a crown. He started as a country gentleman before spending years riding between battlefields and council chambers, trying to hold a broken country together. He stood in muddy fields with soldiers who believed the kingdom could change, eventually crushing royalist armies during the civil wars. In 1649, he stood among the men who approved the trial that ended King Charles I's reign. Documents preserved from the High Court of Justice show his name among those who signed the warrant ordering the fatal sentence. He accepted responsibility for the new state, stepping forward to guide the republic. For nearly 5 years, he ruled as Lord Protector. He reorganized the military, signed state papers, and met ambassadors to keep a restless population steady after years of violence. When he died from illness in September 1658, physicians and witnesses placed his final days at Whitehall Palace. The government buried him with the absolute dignity of a head of state. Records from Westminster Abbey list black velvet banners, state processions, and formal mourning. Embalmers treated the interior of his body according to the practices used for important leaders. His coffin was placed in the Henry VII Chapel, securing his position alongside England's most powerful historical figures. He gave his life to replace a crown with a republic. The system he built collapsed almost immediately. 2 years later, Charles II came back from exile to reclaim the throne his father had lost. The men who supported the new king demanded a public reckoning. The Restoration government began reviewing the past, creating lists of people connected to the previous regime. Many participants faced intense investigation. Some fled the country, while others faced trials. While standard history often summarizes the aftermath by stating a few surviving rivals faced court sentences, the archives hold a completely different narrative. A parliamentary order dated December 4th, 1660, shows a deliberate, calculated decision to target a man who was already dead. Members of the House of Commons voted to exhume the bodies of the former Lord Protector and 2 of his closest allies, Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw. Bradshaw had presided over the king's trial, and Ireton had commanded troops during the conflict. The government did not act in a spontaneous moment of anger. The Cavalier Parliament scheduled the event for a highly specific date. They chose January 30th, 1661. That day mattered enormously. It was exactly 12 years after the sentence carried out against King Charles III. The timing transformed a simple exhumation into an act of political theater. Workers entered the abbey on January 26th to open the graves. Burial notes that survived long after the event confirmed the exact location where the remains had rested. The coffins came out of the earth. Because the bodies had been embalmed, the tissue had survived long enough for the monarchy to execute their plan. Pulling them from the chapel erased their place in the national memory, stripping away the recognition received at their funerals. The space returned to royal control, and the coffins began a forced journey across London. Official notices directed the transport to Tyburn, a location standing far outside the city center. For centuries, Tyburn served as the main site where the state sent common offenders to face the final sentence of English law. Bringing the former leader there placed him on the exact same level as ordinary criminals. The procession through the cold, wet streets of the capital did not happen quietly. Soldiers tied the coffins to sledges. Wooden hurdles typically pulled through the mud when prisoners traveled to the gallows. They dragged the remains from Holborn, following the identical path condemned people took during their last journey. Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator, kept a diary during this period. On January 30th, he recorded that massive crowds gathered along the muddy roads. People watched, shouted, and laughed, treating the public humiliation like a festival. The authorities wanted the entire city to witness this spectacle. Fear and public display helped restore their authority, warning anyone who might challenge the crown. The diary stayed private for years, hidden in manuscripts, but once published, it showed exactly how ordinary citizens consumed the propaganda. When the wooden frames finally reached the gallows, the state carried out a ritual meant to rewrite the legacy of the Civil War. The bodies were suspended in chains and displayed publicly throughout the day. Witness testimony describes the remains hanging there until late afternoon, forcing the crowd to look at the men who had once governed their country. The process rigidly followed the traditional sequence applied to living traitors. By going through these motions, the restored regime legally reclassified the Commonwealth as a period of illegitimate rule. Once the display ended, officials took the remains down and separated the heads from the bodies. That act closed the ceremony at the gallows, but it launched the next phase of the monarchy's message. The government ordered the primary head taken to Westminster Hall, a building carrying massive political weight. Since the Middle Ages, the hall had hosted coronation feasts, courts, and the trials of powerful figures. More importantly, it was the exact courtroom where the king had faced Parliament in 1649. Authorities placed the head on a tall pole about 20 feet high above the roofline. Anyone approaching the doors, including politicians, foreign diplomats, and judges, had to walk beneath the remains of the man who had challenged the crown. This location turned the architecture of the city into a tool for revenge. The hall that had once witnessed a king's trial now held the rebels' remains. The warning lasted far longer than the Republic itself. Through the entire reign of Charles II and into the reign of James II, the display remained visible. Wind, rain, and frost slowly mummified the tissue, turning it into a permanent landmark above the Capitol. Decades passed, a length of time exceeding many modern political careers, and the message stayed locked in place. Then nature intervened where politics could not. Around the late 1680s, a violent gale swept across London, shaking the buildings around Westminster. Contemporary reports indicate the spike sustained damage and the skull fell to the ground below. At that exact moment, the government documents fall completely silent. No formal report explains where the relic went, and no state archive records a recovery effort. Later accounts suggest a sentry station nearby found the object and quietly took it home instead of reporting it. That single undocumented decision stripped the object of its state control. A symbol designed by the monarchy to project absolute power vanished into the hands of ordinary citizens. The silence in the archives lasted for about 25 years, creating a massive gap in the chain of custody. Without tracking, the remains transformed from a political warning into a highly sought-after commodity. By 1710, newspaper references and museum advertisements placed the missing relic in a collection in London. A man named Claudius Dupuy operated a cabinet of curiosities filled with historical artifacts, and he displayed the skull to paying crowds. The transformation was absolute. What began as a brutal state punishment was now an entertainment spectacle. When Dupuy died in 1738, auction records show the contents of his museum were sold, pushing the item into a new network of buyers. It eventually passed to an actor named Samuel Russell, who struggled with intense debt. Memoirs preserved by collectors describe Russell pulling the relic out during drinking gatherings, treating the former ruler of England like a party trick. Financial trouble forced Russell to sell it to James Cox, a jeweler known for lending money against valuable oddities. Cox viewed the skull purely as an investment. The commercial exploitation continued when two brothers named Hughes, acquired it and attempted to stage an exhibit in Bond Street in 1799. Advertisements announced the show, asking visitors to pay for entry. However, newspapers reported deep skepticism from the public, and attendance remained terribly low. People expressed discomfort with displaying human remains, forcing the exhibit to close quickly. Yet the money surrounding the legend only encouraged forgeries. Because the actual chain of custody was broken after 1685, multiple skulls began appearing across the country. Showmen and promoters presented different objects, each arriving with an elaborate, convincing story. At one point, financial accounts show a sale price for a claimed relic reaching roughly 800s, a massive fortune in the 19th century. Famous historians like Thomas Carlyle examined the competing items, dismissing some as fraudulent nonsense. While private buyers traded the objects, major institutions started backing away. Correspondence from the 19th century shows the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford considered acquiring one of the leading candidates. The curators ultimately rejected the proposal, citing ethical concerns about displaying remains tied to political humiliation. This decision kept the relic entirely outside the protection of official archives. Instead, a man named Josiah Henry Wilkinson purchased the primary candidate in 1815. Documents within his family line trace the transfer, and for the next century, the Wilkinsons acted as private guardians. They stopped the public exhibitions, storing the skull quietly and only allowing occasional antiquarians to view it. The object that had once hung above the government now sat inside a domestic cabinet. The mystery remained unresolved until 1934, when Dr. Horace Norman Stanley Wilkinson finally permitted a comprehensive scientific study. He granted access to Carl Pearson, a statistician, and Jeffrey Morant, an anthropologist specializing in facial proportions. Their investigation ignored the rumors and focused strictly on physical evidence, producing a 109-page report published in the journal Biometrica. They began by matching the measurements against death masks created shortly after the original funeral. The distances between the eye sockets, jaw structure, and nose aligned perfectly. Furthermore, 17th century artists frequently painted a distinct wart above the left eye. The tissue on the Wilkinson specimen displayed a mark completely consistent with that exact feature. The researchers dug deeper into the physical trauma the bone had suffered. X-rays taken during the examination revealed a rusted iron fragment still embedded deep within the bone. The placement of the metal exactly matched eyewitness descriptions of how the display had been mounted at Westminster Hall. Additionally, the structure near the top showed distinct stitching marks. 17th century documents explicitly describe preparers removing the skull cap to treat the interior before the burial. The relic bore the exact signs of this specific preparation. Finally, the skin and bone contained small puncture holes, consistent with long-term weather exposure and insect damage, aligning with the decades spent outdoors. Rival claimants crumbled under this level of scrutiny. The skull held near Oxford, for instance, lacked any signs of embalming and showed incorrect puncture marks, directly contradicting the historical record. Pearson and Morant assembled their findings, documenting the estimated age at death between 50 and 60 years old, which fit the timeline perfectly. They concluded their extensive report by stating the evidence provided moral certainty regarding the identity. The investigation bridged the gap created when the archives went silent. By documenting the embalming marks, the iron fragment, and the facial proportions, they connected the physical remains directly to the events orchestrated by the restored monarchy. Despite the validation, Dr. Wilkinson recognized the deep tension the object still carried. The former Lord Protector remained a divisive figure, remembered by some as a reformer and by others as a man who governed with brutal authority. Keeping the remains visible risked turning them back into a public spectacle. In 1960, Wilkinson approached Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, where the former leader had studied briefly in 1616 and 1617. He offered the donation with incredibly strict conditions: no public display, no exhibition, and no announcements that might draw crowds. College archives recorded that, on a night in March 1960, a small group gathered inside the chapel. They placed the remains in a container and buried it deep beneath the floor of the antechapel. No plaque marks the spot, and visitors walk across the stone floor completely unaware of what lies beneath. After 3 centuries of exposure, commodification, and debate, the journey ended in total silence. Oliver Cromwell gave his country a decade of relentless leadership, fighting to replace an absolute monarchy with a new system of law. He spent years commanding troops, signing laws, and holding a fractured kingdom together through sheer force of will. The system he built rewarded him with a royal funeral, only to tear him out of the earth 2 years later when the political winds shifted. The new government turned his body into a warning, and private citizens turned his head into a financial asset passed around drinking tables and auction blocks. He gave his youth, his health, and his life to reshape England. In return, the state dragged his corpse through the mud and left his remains on a spike until the weather tore them down. If you have ever given everything to build something, only to watch the people who took over discard your contributions and erase your name the moment you stopped serving, the pattern was designed exactly this way.